Okay, this is capital budgeting. We're going to do problem 8 and hopefully 9 and 10 in this video. If not, we'll do it in the other ones in another video. You are considering the following two mutually exclusive projects. Project A and Project B. Find the crossover point. Okay, basically the crossover point, you just take the difference between the two projects that are mutually exclusive, take the difference between the two projects, each cash flow, subtract one from the other, and then figure out the internal rate of return. That gives you the percentage, which is the crossover point, which is basically when you think about it, remember the internal rate of return is when you take the cash flows, discount them to where the cash flows equal, or the net present value of those cash flows equals 0. Okay, so if you figure the IRR, which is the point at which the net present value is equal to 0, if it's equal to 0, that means that these things are equal to each other. It's not really that complicated. Kind of get in your head, it might be. So all you do is basically take these numbers. Once you figure out the delta, don't worry about the negative sign. 21,000, 21,000, the delta is 0, of course. 7,000, and you can do these in either order because the plus and minus signs will change, but usually project A minus project B. So 7,000 minus 15,000. Actually put a negative 8,000 number in there because that is the difference. And here it's a positive 2,000, and these numbers are flipped on period 3, so it's a plus 8,000 cash flow. So you hit second FV, excuse me, gotta turn it on. Second CF, I should say. Okay, so second CF, second clear, second FV for time value money. Okay, so your first cash flow is 0, so you can just arrow down. Second one is negative 8,000. Remember, you can have an actual cash flow in one of the periods as a negative number. So 8,000 negative, you got to hit the enter, and it's only going to be one time. Then you got 2,000, 2,000, enter, bop, and that's for one period of time. And then you got a positive 8,000, 8,000, enter, go down to the frequency, and now remember, with the crossover, you want to figure out the IRR, not the net present value. And they're kind of related because the IRR, they're not related, but the IRR tells you what interest rate at which your net present value equals 0. Okay? So the IRR, remember, it's always going to show 0, or if there's a number saved in there, it's going to show you that number, and you got to hit compute. So it's saying at 13.28%, these cash flows equal 0, the net present value of them. So if they equal 0, those two cash flows have to be equal at that point, and that's why they call it the crossover. I'm not sure why you would use that, but it was in your book. Okay, then the last two parts of the problem 8 are just saying which project would you accept if the required rate of returns were 12% and 14%. So all you do is you go through and figure out the net present value at that point, right? Because this is giving you, this is the required rate of return, the cost of capital, the discount rate, whatever you want to call that. And so all you do is take these cash flows at 12% and see which one has the higher net present value, then at 14% and see which one has the higher net present value. Okay, and in number 1, it's in this case it's A for 12% and B for 14%. You know how to do that, so I won't go through and show you. Okay, question number 9. You're considering two mutually exclusive projects again. The required return is 14%. Which project would you accept? And this is really straightforward. You just go through and figure out the net present value for each one using 14%. It works out to where A, the net present value, is negative 121, and B, it's 1,215, so you would choose project B. Pretty straightforward. Remember that your initial CF0 is going to be a negative number because it's your initial cost, which means it's money out of your pocket. These numbers are typically positive, but they could be negative too, because these are cash flows when they're positive that are coming back to you. When they're negative, it means you actually have to chip in more money. Like if this is a negative 9,000 here, it means you have to Not only did you have to put an initial investment of $24,000, but in year 2 you had to chip in another $9,000. So those could be negative. But I would think that the CFO, the cash flow of the first year 0, basically, before you start, is always going to be negative. That's number 9. And number 10. A firm is reviewing a project that has an initial cost of $71,000. That's going to be negative for CFO. The project will produce annual cash flows of year 1, $8,000, $13,400, $18,600, $33,100, and finally year 5, $37,900. What is the profitability index? So this is the PI. If the discount rate is 11%. Okay, so what you do is, now remember, your professor had kind of an unusual term when we talked about it before. It's not net present value, it's present value of future cash flows over initial investment cost or initial cost, whatever you want to call that. And remember, the difference between the present value of the cash flows and the net present value of cash flows is the present value of cash flows. You take those cash flows, which in this case are $8,000, $13,400, $18,600, $33,100, and $37,900, and you discount them back to period 0 at 11%. That tells you what the present value of those cash flows. Net present value is you take that same number you just figured out, the present value of those cash flows, and you subtract the initial cost. That tells you your net present value, which would be positive. It means you've made a profit, basically, or you'll make a profit. If it's negative, it means you'll lose money for that period of time with those cash flows. The profitability index is basically just telling you the present value of the future cash flows, not the net present value, the present value. So you don't use this number in figuring out the net present value. You figure out the present value, but you still use this number. You just use this as a denominator. So you take the present value of those future cash flows, which in this case, all these 5 cash flows discounted at 11% got you to $75,978, and you divide it by your initial cost, and that gives you your profitability index. It doesn't, I don't know, it just depends on, I don't know why you would use it as much. It isn't used that much. It's not as good as having the IRR or the net present value. Okay, that's 8, 9, and 10.